Good morning, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Well, we're here to talk about what it means to build a defensible program for security and safety in AI-enabled systems. And what we're trying to explore is the concept of a fast GRC, fast governance, risk and compliance, that can kind of thread the needle between fostering innovation and managing risk. We're going to use the vehicle, no pun intended, of a hypothetical logistics software management company as a way of kind of walking through a series of injects to highlight things that can go wrong and what scaffolding and guardrails can be put in place. But before we do that, let me introduce our panel. I'm Adam Miles. I'm principal and responsible for cybersecurity and safety at the Chertoff Group, which is a security advisory firm founded almost 20 years ago by Michael Chertoff after he left service as Secretary of Homeland Security. I started my career at the U.S. Justice Department in the criminal division, grew up there, Department of Homeland Security, Raytheon Company. I've been at the firm for 13 years. John?
Hi, John, principal with the Chertoff Group and founder of Edify, formerly CTO of Cigital and then eventually Synopsys, and now Black Duck, I guess. I've spent the last 30 years working on software, the last 3 years building software with AI agentically. So I'll be focusing on the product security aspects of this.
Dan.
I'm Dan Sutherland. I'm a senior advisor at the Chertoff Group. I have just recently retired from Meta, where I led the cybersecurity legal team there, and will comment some on my experiences there at Meta as we talk about the issues this morning. I was the first chief counsel at CISA and helped launch that agency as well.
I'm Ben Jolson, principal at the Chertoff Group. I'm the knuckle dragger at the firm, the physical security guy, as you can tell by my everything. I'm glad to be here with you guys. I think there's some interesting nexus between what's happening in the cyberspace and what's happening in the physical space in ways that AI can, both accelerate and create some opportunities. So super excited to kind of talk through what we're seeing and get to know everybody here. We'll be around afterwards as well. So great to meet everybody. And I was also an Air Force security forces officer before I joined the firm.
So there's obviously a lot of innovation and adoption of AI technology. If we think about OpenAI, just as an example, OpenAI in 2025 went from 300 million to over 800 million monthly active users. You look at Checkmarx, which is a software security company, when they talk to their customers, 78% are saying that 40% or more of their code bases are AI enabled now. That's 20 percentage points up from a year ago. When you look at just the sheer volume of code that exists out there in the environment, GitHub is saying that code commits are expected to rise 16-fold in 2026. So huge amounts of adoption of velocity in this space. How do we think about this from a risk perspective? And so the way we kind of bucket things from a technology risk perspective are really threefold. Defensively, we're worried about AI as a weapon and how it can be used to conduct reconnaissance, develop adversarial resources, achieve initial access, et cetera, et cetera. We're also interested in how it can identify and exploit vulnerabilities, which we'll talk about. We're also focused on AI systems as a target. The more ubiquitous AI technology becomes, the more of a target is for people that have malign intent. And then we also think about unintended consequences of the legitimate use, unintended safety consequences of legitimate use of artificial intelligence systems. Then maybe from a physical security perspective, you kind of hinted at some of the touch points into the physical domain, but very briefly,
so I missed? Recognizing we probably have a diverse audience here of folks that are both looking to leverage AI to accelerate GRC in a corporate capacity. There's probably some folks in a policy capacity that are here that are trying to understand exactly how they can regulate potentially AI into more of a safe and effective framework. And then we have folks that maybe are in the AI ecosystem themselves. So in that sort of triangle between energy, data, and memory are operating companies in those spaces. And I think Depending on where you fall in that sort of stakeholder landscape, AI is going to create potential risks and opportunities. So if you're in that sort of operator space where you're dealing in data, energy, memory, and we work with several of those clients, you're probably seeing an increase in threats. And folks that kind of a converging risk surface around nation-state level interest in what you're doing, and also disgruntled individuals that are looking for symbolic targets to take out their frustration on. We saw the Sam Altman attack at his residence a couple of weeks ago. The Duke Energy CEO was targeted even more recently than that in a report that came out yesterday. So I think if you're in that part of the ecosystem where you're in frontline sort of AI companies in one of those areas of the triangle, you're thinking about rising risks and concerns from a physical security perspective, how you're keeping your executives safe, how you're keeping your data center safe, your physical spaces safe. And I think John can touch on how AI is changing a bit of endpoint security and how we think about physical spaces. If you're on the other side and you're thinking about how can I use AI to accelerate GRC, I think you're also considering some of those physical risks and concerns and how they're escalating potentially at your company based on that backdrop of converging risks that I mentioned. And we really think of AI as a speed to decision-making tool, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on in the panel in terms of getting a defensible solution, getting your leadership to a defensible solution quicker, and how you can use AI to do that with some of the disparate data sets in the physical space. So obviously a lot there to unpack, but I know there's a broad sort of group of stakeholders here, so I wanted to acknowledge that depending on where you fall in that sort of ecosystem, you'll have a bit of a nuanced view of how we think about AI when it comes to security and GRC.
Ben, you talked a little bit about the policy space.
Yeah.
There are trustworthy AI frameworks. We have the NIST AI Risk Management Framework. We've got ISO 42001. I think part of the challenge with those frameworks from a security and safety perspective is they necessarily operate at a level of abstraction to maintain flexibility. And so do you actually get down to kind of a level of detail on how do we map risk to controls effectiveness, et cetera? There's also some murkiness in the kind of regulatory and litigation environment. And Dan, maybe just as a setup to frame what we're going to get into, you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think there's three ways to think about the regulation that we see emerging, three different approaches. The first approach is maybe a restrictionist approach. This is a dangerous world, a dangerous environment. We need to pause at every opportunity. There's legislation in Congress to pause the building of data centers, for example, so restrictionist. The second is the opposite, accelerationist or pro-innovation. This is the argument there is this is a critical time in this space, and you need to give innovators as much room as they possibly can have, so very, very little regulation. And the third is perhaps in between, people who believe in targeted guardrails or some light regulation that helps shape kind of where we're going and how we're kind of developing. This is really the space where we are operating and will continue to operate. I believe neither one of the other two extremes. For example, you have United States state laws that are governing the development of AI in so many different ways. I think there's over 1,000 different bills that have been introduced in state legislatures on this point. There's other countries, South Korea, Singapore, the EU laws. So anybody who's in this space has to operate in the environment of some guardrails that you have to adjust to. This is the world in which we live, not so much the other two, but I think it's important to see and understand the other two environments. I'll just say the last thing, that even those in the White House who have been advocating the pro-innovation framework the most aggressively, you've seen in the papers now, are even thinking about some sort of pre-approval of large language models before they're released. So even in that, people who are in that camp are thinking about some sort of guardrails that we need to put in this space. So.
All right, so let's get into our hypothetical. We will have a Q&A session at the end, but please make this a discussion. And so as we're going through the inject, if folks have observations, questions, feel free to raise your hand and say something. So we're going to talk about a hypothetical AI-enabled logistics management software company. So we're going to talk about Truck Norris AI. Of course, we used AI to pick the name of the company. Truck Norris AI optimizes freight routing. So it ingests historical and real-time data around things like live traffic, weather, regulatory safety hazards, crime data, data on the vehicle in question, as well as driver hours data. It's built on top of a frontier model. It's a SaaS offering hosted in an IaaS solution. Customers include both what I'd call kind of traditional freight management trucking companies, as well as autonomous trucking companies as well. Although Truck Norris itself is not the operator of autonomous trucks. It basically sells its services to that community. Because of what it does, there has been some controversy around Truck Norris AI from a kind of a job displacement perspective, right? We're focused on, are we creating kind of a level of redundancy for dispatchers? And then on the autonomous side, are we having an impact on people whose professions is in the physical freight transformation business? This company has seen security and safety as something that customers are going to care about, and so they're trying to demonstrate best practice. They're about $200 million in ARR. They have SOC 2 Type 2 certification, and they have an ISO 27001 certification. Like most others in the AI-enabled space, they are also using AI-enabled coding assistance. So that's a little bit of background context about Truck Norris AI. Okay, so we're in the present day, and our development team is using agentic coding assistants. And one of our coding assistants has fetched an open source geospatial data software processing library. It's been through the testing that it should have gone through, had some static analysis done to it, and it's been merged in. This happened. So this happened several weeks ago. Yesterday, security researchers identified a remote code executable vulnerability in this particular library. And so now we're in the position of trying to figure out what actually to do about this thing that our coding assistant has merged in. The vulnerability was not known when our coding assistant selected this package, but it is now. In fact, the researchers who identified the vulnerability, not surprisingly, used AI-enabled vulnerability identification to identify it. Think Mythos, if you will, or something like that. So, John, let me turn it over to you. So to what extent, and I'm going to zoom in very particularly on this, and then we'll zoom out a little bit, to what extent can our AI enablement help remediate the situation we're in right now?
So working with a lot of senior vice presidents of application delivery and product security leaders, CISOs, everybody's saying the same thing, both personally and then study-wise. Senior engineers who are good technologists and good tool users can use tools like AI to accelerate things like the response to situations like this. However, most organizations are measuring that less than 2%, closer to 1% of their population reflects that kind of user. And so we're in a very dangerous time as it pertains to AI. The NIST framework, the ISO frameworks, they don't give me as a product security leader concrete guidance like the CIS benchmarks did for cloud, like supply chain security has historically done for our open source. So even though this vulnerability here I'm reacting to involves some open source and I have a playbook for that, I don't have a playbook for how the attackers used AI, for how my development team used AI, and whether or not I had guardrails that were effective. And so, that playbook doesn't exist. There is no secure software development lifecycle equivalent as an AI secure software development lifecycle right now. And as an industry, moreover, we're moving from a situation in which we went from vibe coding, about a year ago to we're doing some agentic engineering, but 24 months from now, we're going to be doing substantially different AI development. Everybody on the vanguard is tooling up an orchestration layer, if you've heard about that. The ability to get agents to run unattended for a day or more to accomplish more and more with millions of tokens to get the job done. So the 60% increase in code comes from our transition to that. But again, just like we don't have an AI DLC that's secure, we don't have orchestration that has baked security in. So I'm wrestling with reacting to this situation while I'm trying to be proactive and put in place the guardrails that you talked about to make sure that I have a secure AI DLC. It's a very interesting inflection point. From a reaction perspective, I have to solve that problem today. I'm not going to be able to use AI effectively to scale up my remediation unless I already have processes in place to do the kind of reaction, let's call it first, incident response, root cause analysis, remediation planning, and then implementation and validation and rollout. If my organizational processes from a product security perspective don't already contain those playbooks in writing of this form, I'm not going to be able to get them into agentic form effectively. So what this is going to do is it's going to expose my readiness to automate and scale. If you're on the vanguard, you're probably already building those playbooks for AI remediation. If you're not on the vanguard, what that means is that as a product security person, I have to talk with legal, with physical, with others, and figure out what our playbooks are, and I have to play catch up pretty rapidly on that. Because unfortunately, it's going to be my goal as the stakeholder in this group to turn what they have as playbooks or thoughts on this particular breach and situation and digitize it. Digitize it into agents that are going to allow me to do this remediation, both of the root cause that is present right this second in the piece of the business we found it, and then propagate it out to the rest of the business so it can't just be moved to the next piece of the business that remains vulnerable. So I think from a product security perspective, in this sort of 24 months of uncertainty as we transition approach and technology-wise, I'm almost like a diplomat to the other expertise in the business, and I have to bear the secretarial role of, again, digitizing and agentifying what our response is.
So in that space of uncertainty, what role does threat modeling play? And how do you think about who needs to be at the table when we're trying to think about what severe but plausible scenarios might look like?
Yeah, so threat modeling is a formal way I can engage this process in this roundtable. Historically, product security, anyone from product security or security groups in here? Okay, so one of the challenges we've had historically is we've tooled up and we report a lot of measures on work we do. We ran this many tools on this many things. We have this many vulnerabilities. Those work metrics don't mean a lot to legal about risk. So I think the key is elevating the conversation into a threat model posture so that we can ask questions like, we're collecting this geopolitical data through open source. How could organized crime affect where our trucks are so that they can steal from them more quickly? This is a risk we face. As we work through MCP and other agentic means with our partners and third parties, we're collaborating with them, but we're also competing. How can they use our agentic interfaces that we expose to, instead of collaborate, compete with us and steal our lunch? What risks do we face there? Again, I can, as a product security person, bring this threat modeling exercise to the table and help exercise this pursuit, but I need these other perspectives from the organization to bring in risk, legal, compliance, and the other aspects that take this from 30 criticals across 300 applications into these are the consequences we must avoid.
That's a really important point, because I think when we think about threat scenarios, right, we started, the teaser to this was the inject that focused on vulnerable open source code. But as we're thinking about what could go wrong from an impact point of view, the aperture has to get larger, right? We think about things that have really no relation to code, but that have relation to things like permissive access. So, I mean, Ben, what could go wrong with a logistics management system with overly permissive access from what you're seeing on the physical security side?
I mean, it's everything from the sort of physical safety concerns that could happen if you had a nefarious actor that was trying to cause mischief to, I think the cargo security use case that John brought up is extremely relevant. I mean, we are seeing in the industry rampant use of criminal actors trying to stand in the legitimate shoes of a legitimate supplier or OEM or manufacturer, as an example in Mexico, to convey narcotics into this country. So if you have a God's eye view of where all of those crates are headed and all of those trucks are headed, you can plan your network, your receiving network, a lot more precisely, and you can really accelerate your cross-border flow of contraband. So that's one area where automation is great, visibility is great, having a God's eye view of your logistics supply chain for just-in-time manufacturing is wonderful, but if it falls into the wrong hands, they just now have open access to how they can plan their own nefarious use of your supply chain. And we'll talk a little bit more about how gaining access to sensitive data could facilitate additional areas of mischief and criminal concerns. But right off the bat, that would be an area that we would be focused on. And it could jeopardize things like if the company is a member of CTPAT, the Customs and Trade Partnership Against Terrorism, and they have fast lane access over the border, as an example of Truck Norris is, where our clients are in this fictional scenario, our customers, then we're putting that at risk to invite additional scrutiny from government. And Lord knows right now, the last thing we want is to have any contraband coming over the border, given the state of the state and where we're dealing with things.
Can I make a comment about
Please.
governance, risk, and compliance programs? You have to have, in this environment, we're all focused on developing and deploying as fast as we can, but we must have governance, risk, and compliance programs in place. The problem is that governance, risk, and compliance takes time, and time is at a premium. Governance, risk, and compliance as a profession is a process-oriented thing. I'm a lawyer, and we lawyers are taught to reason by studying precedents and analogies, and that takes time. When I first got to Meta, they asked me to put together a description of the regulatory risk landscape. And I thought, wow, that's fantastic. So I wrote a 50-page memo, thick with, but we did a really good job. We boiled it down to like 3 pages. So that was, I think anybody who's a lawyer will say, wow, you've really done a good job. 50-page law review down to 3 pages. I handed it to the product manager who had asked me for it, and she said, oh, that's great. She said, we don't really read memos here. Could you translate that into a spreadsheet? We can deal with that. And that was my first introduction to, we've got to move fast. I have a friend who just left government, really good lawyer, and he's gone to a tech company. And he said to me that the move, I'm just reading an email, it said the move from idea to action is perhaps the most shocking. So we've got to develop fast GRC. And I know that it is possible because we had to do that at Meta. There would be times when there would be, hey, I need comment on this. We're meeting with Mark Zuckerberg at 3:30. We need to lay out what the risks are associated with this. 3:30? What are you talking about? I need like 4 weeks. But that's, you have to learn how to do that. And the whole legal department, for example, has to buy into that this is the way we're practicing law now, and we know you're making a quick decision. I'm going to stand behind that because that's a methodology that we've understood and stand with, and we'll back you on that.
And I think part of that, Dan, is how do you make GRC engineering traceable? right?
Yes. You've got to figure out some ways. I think John mentioned it, but some of your GRC principles, you have to develop them in advance, and then you can automate them so that an AI agent is conducting a good bit of your governance, risk, and compliance. They're making sure that the thing that you're doing now fits those guardrails that we've predetermined. But you do have to have human interaction at certain times, and you have to speed that. You have to already know who the key players are. Those people need to be read into what the product is trying to do, so that when it said, we've got a meeting in 45 minutes with the boss, they can respond quickly and can give commentary on the risks and make comments on the compliance and other things. Yeah. Could I shift our hypothetical?
So what happens next?
Okay, what happens next is we've done all the setup, but then something goes wrong. So Truck Norris's platform ingests real-time telematics data from dozens of carrier-sided vendors to enrich its AI routing model with live traffic, weather, vehicle health, drivers' data. One of these vendors, a mid-tier telematics provider called Fleet Pulse, is compromised by a sophisticated threat actor. The attacker injected into that company's software carefully crafted adversarial instructions that made it so that it was embedded within legitimate-looking telematics payloads that were designed to manipulate Truck Norris's AI routing model into generating anomalous routing recommendations. So the instructions caused the truck AI's model to recommend carrying hazardous materials onto routes with low bridge clearances, routing standard freight through residential areas during school hours, and recommending routes that would cause drivers to exceed their hours of service limits. So we've got a situation, we've got an incident now happening. Adam, how is incident response in this context different from incident response in a typical cybersecurity context?
Yeah, so maybe first of all, as a setup, like, why would someone do this in the first place? And I think the answer to that is when you look at what's been happening in the world over the last year, it's not inconceivable that you have cyber extortionists that have sociopathic tendencies, that are looking for opportunities to create disruption to incentivize ransom payments. We've also seen state-driven cyber attacks against hospitals and other primary healthcare. Think about the Stryker incident that was affected by Handala, an Iranian Ministry of Intelligence and Security proxy group, right, where you're impacting medical device products, that are serving patients. So from a motivation point of view, that's the setup. To come back to the kind of the upfront GRC, okay, before we start talking about control compliance and stuff like that, what's the riskiness of this thing? Part of what we're trying to do at the front end is to say, okay, we're logistics management. There's safety impacts here. That ups the criticality and the risk of this product. And so how do we think about what's in place to add kind of orthogonal capabilities to create for a safer experience? So one of the things that Truck Norris AI has invested in is a separate AI system that provides safety verification for its routing recommendations. So we've got a separate, independently maintained AI system that's looking at road conditions, vehicle specifications, weather, hazmat restrictions, weight limits, to basically look at the first recommendations and say, as a guardrail, is there something wrong here? In addition to which, we also have a more basic layer of analysis that's saying, based on this route and the history of this route, are we seeing some large deviation in route? And so our independent safety layer, when we started to see these misclassifications, caught 11 of the 14 misrouting instances that occurred before this incident was escalated. And the route anomaly system and caught the other 3. So at the end of the day, we had a set of safety-oriented guardrails in place that weren't looking for malware, that weren't looking for kind of a hidden adversarial prompt instruction, but they're looking for an impact that had the effect of preventing our truck from ending up on a bridge that was not built to support its weight. But the question now becomes for the company, okay, this has happened, something suspicious is going on here. We don't know what it is. What do we do about it? And so the second thing that happens is back in the kind of the risk classification, the threat modeling part of the exercise, the company decided that it needed to be able to run its solution in no pun intended safe mode. So we have the ability to operate Truck Norris AI in a degraded level of functionality where we're not using reasoning and advanced AI to define what truck routing models are, but we're using a more basic set of static safety data to deterministically define what the approach should be. But at the same time, there's a human element here as well. Someone's got to make a decision about, do we go to safe mode? Do we turn the system off entirely? And that is not an AI decision. I mean, that is a human decision. Our company has customers. Is anyone going to talk to them about what's happening? So we have in our incident response and our crisis management playbook, we also have mechanisms for reaching out to our customers to say, we have an issue, we're not quite sure what's happened, but here's what we're doing about it. And so there is a very human element to this that we're building into the playbook as well.
What would you think about technical incident response, technical elements of incident response?
Yeah, so I think we break it down into preparation, detection, and then remediation recovery. From a preparation point of view, we're classifying the riskiness of these systems, right? And we're using that to define the attack surface, the threat modeling, the stuff we're talking about. A key part of that is making sure that we actually have preserved the right logs, such that when something does happen, we can actually go back and try to understand, okay, what prompts actually occurred? Did we have textual instructions where we really only expected to see numerical data? Well, the only way to figure that out is if we have logs to support that. From a detection point of view, to come back to that example, we talked about some of the strategies that could already be in place. But are we also, from a prompt injection point of view, looking for, again, situations where we've got kind of large textual patterns where we really would have only expected to see numerical data? From a remediation point of view, we're thinking about, okay, we have this this supplier that's caused us a problem. Have we isolated that supplier, cut that supplier off, and then what are we going to need to do from the point of view of testing, validation before we're comfortable moving back into full operating mode?
Great. Maybe before we shift I think there was one question and other questions or comments.
That's a great question.
Can you repeat the question?
Repeat the question.
Sorry. So we want to remediate. We want to use agents to remediate. Agents are non-deterministic. That scares me. How do we deal with that? Are you a parent? Security people and lawyers get along, I think, because We're control freaks. We want 4 weeks to build a 50-page document. I want to do a deep RCA, and I want to do the coding myself on the remediation. Thank you very much, and then I'll validate it. That's a control problem. Much like parenting, we have to let go. Risk management isn't an exact science, right? We're never going to get to zero risk. None of us in this room believe that. And when our kids become teenagers, they stop listening to us. And that's the way agents work. The key here, and there's a really important seed of true truth in this, is that accountability is a problem. And when you were talking about what I'll call the just-in-time briefing to Zuckerberg, we've gone from the legacy world in which we built very baroque, very complex, very onerous manual security mechanisms for detection and remediation to just-in-time remediation. We've shifted everywhere, not just left. So we have preventative to the left and we have runtime to the right. We did things like WAFs. We do things like logging and monitoring, and we're resilient. To me, think about JP Morgan Chase's fraud prevention. They go very fast in their business, and the reason they go very fast is because their fraud detection is very good. They've let out some of the control. They've gone non-deterministic. And so they're able to move much more rapidly. So the first thing is to let go and allow the agents to do this. Now, that's not going to fix our accountability problem. Someone has to be accountable for the RCA and for the remediation. And so we need to figure out a way to inject accountability into this agentic set of workflows we're doing. There's 2 things we can do. We can add a security AI DLC, so that when our agents are coding in a green or brown field, or when they're doing remediation, they're following a workflow. If you people are Claude people, then you can use plugins, and you can use skills, and you can use templates, and you can drive that thing into a compulsory process. That compulsory process can incorporate both agentic mechanisms of control and deterministic mechanisms of control. And so in the most advanced of these I've seen and worked on thus far, they've mixed those 2 things. So Adam said, I'm going to expect that there's going to be a filter on input from my third party that makes sure that this data is only alphanumeric or just simply numeric, because it's routing data. And so that could be a deterministic check that's a guardrail, that's a skill that's put into the plugin. This plugin, this workflow, this template stuff is that orchestration that I referred to early on that will be very prevalent in the frontier models in 24 months, but that we're sort of bushwhacking on right now. And so unfortunately, for most organizations, you're forced to, as I think I mentioned, skate to where you think the puck will be on orchestration to provide those secure AI DLC guardrails and mix them between deterministic and agentic in nature. And I think as a product security person, again, I'm the emissary that's going to digitize this for GRC, for legal, and for others compliance. But I need them at the table so that my defense isn't, it's just what my developer thought. It is instead, it's what the risk committee diagrammed, documented, and decided it would be. It's multifaceted. It involves these different controls, some of which are deterministic, some of which are non-deterministic.
If I can also add into that too, I think some of what you're seeing is eerily reminiscent of what we've experienced in the physical security space for a long time, which is attacks are as creative as the individuals that are executing them. So it's been very difficult to plan and model every single type of attack scenario, and that's why you've seen, whether it's the counterterrorism or anti-terrorism apparatus, shifting more towards mitigation and away from detecting these large terrorist networks and focusing more on lone wolf actors and things that they can do with everyday objects, driving a truck into a crowd of people. So in some ways, the way that physical security experts think about threats and adversaries is non-deterministic, and it is governed by the creativity of the adversary themselves. So there are some lessons learned in how we view that type of risk too, where we can kind of stack hands and think through mitigation and defense in depth in a way that we don't have full visibility into how the adversary might act.
It changes the way you think about testing. You've got a non-deterministic solution. You're almost necessarily not going to expect the same outcome. And so how do we think about sampling? How do we think about threat modeling, is informing what the scenarios are that we test against. How do we think about essentially what the impacts are?
There was one more question, I think, over there, Adam.
There's still time.
Couple of thoughts on that. First of all, what you're saying resonates. I think that how we think about this maybe depends on where we sit in the ecosystem. So are we the producer of a technology or the consumer of a technology? Because depending on how we answer that question, there's a variance in what we can do about it. I think part of the challenge with in thinking about what data is telling us is, do we have an underlying knowledge base, a taxonomy that maps out, okay, what do threat scenarios look like? How does that map to an attack surface? Because once you have that, I mean, we're big believers in things like the MITRE attack framework, and MITRE is now building out Atlas as well to help do threat modeling in AI systems. I think that what will be interesting to see is whether companies that do try to act responsibly in this place are rewarded for it, and whether there's an incentivization scheme that drives us towards a greater level of trustworthiness in how these systems are rolled out.
When I heard you speak, I heard myself, so it resonates with me as well. When the internet came about, and I was a Sun, client-server guy, and I wanted everything to stay. And I felt the same thing when we moved to the cloud. I understood the data center; it had a perimeter, and I could keep things inside of it. And now I can't at somebody else's computer. I don't know what they're doing. There's actually, for cynics like us, hope here too, because The average technologist is very poor. They're not good at their job. They're average by definition. When we actually give them a step removed and we force them to use agentic tools, they take their hands off of the wheel a little bit, and in some sense, they become a better driver. For the first time ever, so I wrote one of the first static analysis tools that ever existed. So I've been scanning code since 1996. And I used to think to myself for the last 30 years, like, why can't developers understand programming better? Why don't they have computer science degrees? Why aren't they smarter? The agent can do that for them. I can inject secure coding guidance into the agent in a way that I have never been able to train a single developer, even though I've trained hundreds of thousands of them, I'm sure, over my career. So I think there's a sunny side to this, where these tools do provide us population-level amplification to our controls in a way that the previous technologies maybe did, maybe didn't. You know, I certainly think that for all their faults, Microsoft has done better with their cloud than the average company's data center I've looked at. And we can all poke holes in it, but it's better than on average. So I think there is a silver lining, maybe. I don't think it's all doom and gloom.
So we're going to. So the question is, how can we take the work that's going on in Glasswing and apply it more broadly across the AI ecosystem?
I fear anybody who invents a boogeyman and then suddenly comes up with a solution the next day. So there's a little bit of cynicism on my part there. Risk management, like politics, is local. I really believe that it is about getting the right people in the room and having the conversations and digitizing that into each organization's own world, because like a Chase is different than a Truck Norris is different than all of these things have different risk. I mean, and these guys should speak to that, but to me, I think it's unfortunately a risk committee and a localization problem.
I would also say, so is Mythos a unique breakthrough, or is it reflective of broader advancement? Last week, the UK AI Safety Institute released a study that compared Mythos with GPT 5.5. And what it found was that those capabilities for computer network attack, which was going more against a production environment than vulnerability identification, the capabilities were equal. OpenAI is taking a different approach. I mean, they are taking more of a KYC, you've gone through some level of vetting, we're going to give you access to GPT Cyber than Anthropic is. What the right answer is, I'm not going to speak to, but I think you're going to see a proliferation of the capability. Let's, in the interest of time, we're going to keep things moving here and leave time for more questions, pick up on the scenario a little bit. So we think the scenario has been reasonably well managed, except that what's been going on has leaked out into social media. And so we're starting to see social media chat pick up about what's happened to Truck Norris. And our corporate security team has received an alert. And what's happened is an individual with a history of anti-AI posts has published a series of escalating threats targeting Truck Norris's CEO and mentioning him by name. The post talks about worker layoffs. The recent incident includes the CEO's neighborhood. And the most recent post, published 90 minutes ago, says, someone needs to show these people their algorithms have consequences in the real world. Now, we know the CEO's at home right now, and the CEO's posture, I think, not uncommonly is, I want a minimal visible protection. No protective detail, no visible security personnel at the residence. So Ben, what would have been reasonable for Chuck Norris to have implemented to protect the CEO in this kind of a...
The first reason I'm smiling is because we said in the beginning this is a $200 million a year company, and you said they have a corporate security team. I would argue that most of those, the Fortune 1000, sort of 500 and below, really doesn't have a corporate security team. They've got somebody that's dealing with kind of square badges, polyester uniforms, and access control in the lobby. So the first piece is like we have this facilities-minded approach to security, and now AI is not only creating new risks because people feel like their dignity is impacted when they lose their job and they're getting radicalized. We're seeing a lot more thoughtful adversaries with target selection. Take your pick of any number of incidents, starting with Brian Thompson or the first assassination attempt and moving forward. And now I think you're seeing a lot of companies playing catch up. So they're saying, okay, we have great cybersecurity controls. We hired a CISO. We have a bunch of folks, agentic AI, that's thinking about red versus blue team. But wait a minute, we didn't actually think about the fact that we have physical life safety impacts for our executive teams that can be targeted. So I think the first step is probably looking themselves in the mirror, Chuck Norris, and saying, we've probably under-indexed on this to this point. We haven't really thought about, beyond making sure that folks don't have access to, potentially to our data centers and our physical spaces, how we're actually thinking about executive protection. So in this case, the first thing that they should do is convene that cross-functional kind of threat working group to get to the bottom of, is this a specific credible concern, or are we sort of in the aspirational space? Mm-hmm. This sort of skirts the line. It's kind of, it does, threat actors online have gotten pretty clever with talking around their threats. You saw a lot after Luigi Mangione, Luigi needs to pay a visit to this individual, et cetera, et cetera. That's even being more euphemized in threat chatter online. So the first piece is, do we feel like this is credible? Do we feel like we're in this sort of operational planning stages of a threat, or do we feel like this is aspirational? And then the second piece is, what resources do we have available to deploy in this situation? Do we have any trusted vendors that can actually provide close protection? Have we actually thought about a continuity scenario where we have succession planning and things that we're thinking about if, God forbid, there is an issue? Do we have any internal resources that are even trained to detect, monitor, and respond to and recover from these types of incidents? So I think as a company, as a $200 million company that's SaaS and agile and lean, the first step is we realize that we don't really have any internal physical security talent. Maybe we call the Chertoff Group to come help and be an outsourced fractional chief security officer. And then I think going forward, we have this idea that in our risk register, we now need to consider physical concerns, not just cyber, ransomware, or cyber issues. We now need to recognize that if our CEO is going to be out front on a panel talking about how AI is disrupting the workforce, we probably need to think through layers of controls about who's going to be attending that and what risk surface that's creating. So I think the first step is this is the wake-up call for us and our board. And then I think the second piece is, chances are our board at Chuck Norris has this sort of social diffusion effect where they're sitting on other boards and their compensation committees are asking, well, how much are we spending on protection for our CEO? And are we doing it in a tax-efficient way? And what do we need to be doing? So I think this is just going to be a wake-up call for our company. And then we're going to have to think through the sort of blocking and tackling of how we're analyzing and assessing the credibility of the threat and then surging reasonable controls to protect the CEO. And I would just say personal protection is a radio dial, not a light switch, so we have to be able to turn it up and then also turn it back down to preserve the quality of life for the protectee. But I do think many of you in the room, if you're in these smaller to mid-sized companies, chances are you're not thinking about these risks. And I hope you are. And you don't necessarily have a huge standing team internally to respond to those types of concerns.
Great. Well, let's open the. We've had some questions already, but we've been doing a lot of the talking. So let me come back to the audience for additional questions. And for folks that have questions, actually, what I should have done is asked you kind of to step up. We have a microphone here, so if I can. You'd indulge us to ask for the microphone, that would be great.
Thanks again for the panel discussion. So you've been focused a lot on the technologies, on AI specifically, but a lot of the things that you talk about is actually process-based and also cultural. And you mentioned that not a lot of companies would look at physical security. So how much of it now with AI being more of you mentioned cross-functional. How much do you see companies need to have that cross-functional between the different business lines? Because I know from the cyber side, there was definitely a lot of stovepiping between cybersecurity and physical security. I mean, people didn't realize the physical impact of Colonial Pipeline when that happened, first of all. So we're just trying to see, now that it's elevated with the AI piece, how aware are companies, like your clients, in acknowledging this issue? And what are their responsiveness to your recommendations? Because I think this is the ideal scenario, right? When you had all these things identified, but in reality, people don't even recognize there's an issue or there's a gap.
They're not, just real quickly, and then if you guys want to jump in, but so they're not aware, and they're not at the table anymore. So in 3 of the 4 firms I'm working closely with, the CISO's organization has been left out, and there is a new fast lane for development because you guys just say no, and you take too much time with your assurance, and so we're just going to run. And so now we have that accountability problem. The agents don't have accountability at the human layer. The CISO's organization isn't doing detection or proactive prevention inside that fast lane. And they don't have a strategy for what that secure AI ML DLC looks like. So they're not at the table. So I think that building that risk committee table and getting those other people involved so that you turn from Dr. No into this is the risk-based approach and digitize the other people's expertise into your agentic approach is absolutely essential. I think it's job number 1.
Agreed. I'll just say real fast, in the Meta experience, that's absolutely job number 1 is to get your, they call them XFNs there, get your cross-functional group organized at the beginning. We knew who everybody was, and then when the memo comes across, or we've got to talk to Zuckerberg at 3:30, we already know the 8 people from the different organizations who have to be involved. You know who to get that information to, press them for the answers, and they know each other and have worked together. So it's absolutely job number 1.
I would just add, I think, you used a word that resonated with me, and the word you used was culture. And we've seen in some of the organizations the impact it can have when a CEO comes in and says, we want to be to online safety what Volvo was to the automobile in the late 1950s. And that has a trickle-down effect across the organization. So how do you get that culture going? Sometimes there's an incident, a regulatory incident, there's a teachable moment. In the absence of that, and in the absence of someone that's already predisposed to do that, exercises, I think, become a useful way of walking through a realistic set of scenarios to get an executive leadership team on, like, could this really happen to us? Well, like, here's what decisions you need to make, here's what communications would look like, and that has a way of being a little bit of a teachable moment on its own.
Hi, my name is Walker Evans. Thank you so much for being here. So a lot has been said about AI as a tool for finding vulnerabilities and exploiting them, and rightfully so, with Mythos coming out and that being an advertised function of it. But my question, something that you mentioned that really resonated with me, was when you talked about a shipping being hijacked to transit illegal narcotics. And so I'm sort of thinking about the human element of compromises that's being amplified by AI, deepfake videos and voice calls, phishing scams. And so I wanted to know how you all were thinking about the human-based compromises that are being amplified AI alongside the AI-based ones.
I think it depends, again, where you sit. And maybe I'll say, at the highest level, are we thinking about from someone that's a deployer of AI, or are we thinking about someone that's a developer of AI? From a deployer perspective, I come back to, okay, I'm a trucking company, I'm using this solution. Do I have the same password for everyone that access to the system? Easy point of compromise for an organized crime group to come in. If I'm on the developer side, am I starting to worry about insider threat from the point of view of someone getting into my source code? And I think the controls look somewhat different depending on what the answer is.
Yeah, I think that the short answer is yes, and I think AI is impacting all 3 products of the risk equation: threat, vulnerability, and consequence and impact. So threat, in terms of coming up with these new and novel attack methods that we were talking about earlier. Vulnerabilities, we already talked about finding and then exploiting potential vulnerabilities. And then the human impact and consequence to some of these scenarios, I think, is absolutely top of mind. And it's important that we keep it top of mind to constantly ground sort of risk-based decision making. And I will tell you, kind of two anonymized real-world examples, the deepfake piece is very real. We have clients that are dealing with folks that create a full deepfake dossier saying that somebody's on maybe a certain list that was just released. And they're not actually on the list, but they've created enough of a deepfake surface that it's leaked and the damage is done, and you have a concern. So I think we are going to continue to see new and novel attack frameworks in the threat portion of the risk equation, and then also on the consequence and impact piece when you talk about real-world type consequences. So that absolutely needs to be top of mind. And as risk professionals, we should, without playing chicken little, we should articulate that this has real life safety impacts for our company if we're not appropriately managing it.
I would just, you made me think about a point, which is, I think so much of, in a deepfake conversation, the identity conversation is around, well, how could our employees or a contractor somehow be subverted? I think in many organizations, we don't spend as much time on the customer and thinking about what a safe experience looks like for the customer. And that tradecraft is only getting more complex. I talked about MITRE earlier in this discussion, and I talked about attack and Atlas. Within the last couple of weeks, MITRE has released a new framework called the Fight Fraud Framework that basically creates attack for things like consumer account takeovers. And hopefully we're going to see the emergence of a threat taxonomy that will help people do gap analysis, business case justification, vendor selection, testing for some of those scenarios.
Thank you.
It's Nachiket. I worked on security at multiple cloud companies. I should say this panel was amazing. Thanks for sharing your wisdom. It was amazing, a lot of nuggets. So I had two questions. One was more, a world where two companies control the models usually doesn't seem like a good world to me, and so I just wanted to get your opinion on how do you see the progression of open source models and security, for defenders and so on. And the second question is a bit more of a philosophical one. One is we put all this effort into putting guardrails to make sure the models behave properly, securely, and so on. But then we have adversaries, including nation states, who are just going to develop models which are going to go all out in finding issues, right? So how do you see this asymmetry playing out, where we are putting all the guardrails possible, whereas adversaries will train models which will have no guardrails, which will go all out? So.
Just on the first point, I was listening to a podcast over the weekend about, is AI going to cure cancer? And I'm definitely not an expert in this area, but part of what the discussion was about is all of these systems are dependent on data. And so a large language model isn't really going to help you look at a mammogram or other imagery. And so I think maybe part of this becomes, as this ecosystem matures, are there models that are more specific to specific data sets? And does that create an opportunity for specialization and maybe open source as well? I don't know.
Do you think your second point about we may play by rules and our adversaries will not play by those same rules, and are we hamstringing ourselves in that context? I think that's something we've struggled with, just in geopolitical competition writ large, and how we operate with certain principles that other maybe adversaries don't operate. So you're right, I think it's going to amplify some of those concerns, and I guess you would hope that we have the ability to anticipate some of what they're doing around their activities and the ways that they're not setting up those same types of guardrails. But I think it's a great point. I don't know if we have a great answer for it.
I don't know that. I mean, you can ask ChatGPT what 2 + 2 is, and it will give you the answer for most of the time. But the cost of that answer is not economic. And as you can see from Microsoft's releases this week, they're going to have to turn it off for GitHub because it's too expensive. Yeah. So the question of whether or not you're going to use open source or proprietary models, or you're going to use a frontier model, I think it's going to be hybrid in the same way that cloud is, in the same way that everything has always been. Your adversaries, nation state and corporate, will build weapons suited for their task. Mm-hmm. So, Truck Norris may have an algorithm. They may think it's rather proprietary. Their competition will probably build an agent network that reverses that out. We're just going to use different tools for the same things we've always done.
Yeah.
The rat race continues.
Thank you.
Can I add one thing? From the legal perspective, I need to make sure that our company has a legally defensible process. We operate ourselves in a way that we can defend ourselves if a regulator asks or a court asks. So I found a huge benefit in threat modeling, to get back to your point. As a company, we have modeled out what we think our major threats that we're going to face are. You got to do a good job there, because you're saying the adversary is jumping ahead. You're not always fighting the last battle. Where are they going? So I think as a lawyer, I appreciated having a really strong threat intelligence team in the company. Those people are doing their work that benefits all the rest of us down the road, including the GRC and legal folks, and then passing up to the CEO why they can feel confident in this system and why we have a defensible way that, I mean, the world is very uncertain that we're going into, but we approach it in a defensible way.
And the art of this is to, bring together severe but plausible threat scenarios with an output that's engineering traceable.
Thank you.
How you doing, gentlemen? Thank you for your time today. My name is Brody Jett with Jet Defense Consulting. I spent most of my time in the Air Force dealing with survival instructor, and then went to dealing with policy and then fraud, waste, and abuse. I got out and became an organizational psychologist, and then started my firm and just developed a GRC program for accountability, audits, and the examiners. So my question for you all today is, as organizations build out AI security programs, where do you see the biggest gap between what is defensible security posture looks like on paper versus what can actually be demonstrated to an auditor or examiner at the interaction level?
Look at me. Why are you looking at me? I mean, where do you start? I think we're to the original point. We're in an uncertain landscape, and I don't know that. I think it's very heartening that people like you are developing GRC programs, because I think we're operating in a landscape that is not well sorted out, and we've got to get on top of that. I think, again, to get back to your point, the world is uncertain, but we can establish certainty in our processes. We've got to do it in a cutting-edge way, or a new way than we have done it before. We know how to do it. We just have to really wrap our arms around it. We have to get in these processes in place comprehensively, so I wouldn't pick out a particular part.
And maybe when you said, it sounds process heavy, maybe it's a misnomer, maybe it's visibility. Because to your I have this magic box, and this magic box does cool things really fast for me. Well, okay, what was your, are you're gonna promote someone or fire someone based on what the box said? What's your visibility into whether or not it made the right decision? Right, like if you're gonna underwrite a mortgage, did you follow all the regulations you had to do that? If you're writing code, did it follow a process like your developers did? Was it checked? Were there requirements? Was there a review? So it's not so much process as it is process and visibility. And I think that's, from my perspective, from your perspective, people are just willy-nilly using the tool, the toy. Sorry, I meant to say toy. And I think that's what you were reacting to as well to some extent. And that's the scary part, because we built governance processes. We built policies, standards, and all this artifice to go along with that. And these people are just using toys.
I would just add, I'd use a cybersecurity analogy, and the challenge, I think, in cyber is measuring performance through transparency, accuracy, and precision. And so we can use authoritative frameworks for transparency, traceability, et cetera. The problem is they operate at a level of abstraction. You need flexibility, so remote access is managed. Okay, like how? The accuracy piece becomes an exercise in mapping threat to attack surface to what are you doing about it. And I think that's where the precision piece is specifically around the attack surface, and what have we done to put a mitigation in place. How are we testing it? Obviously, if these systems are non-deterministic, there's a limit to what level of testing you can do, and so we think about a combination of sampling, and then do we have systems that operate orthogonally, basically as a safety valve.
Thank you, gentlemen.
But humans are non-deterministic too.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? And process and oversight and visibility was our hedge against that. It's no different as far as I'm concerned. Like, you could give 4 people a hiring or firing decision, Those 4 people would come up with different answers. They're non-deterministic from our perspective organizationally as well. It's just that we have process and policy, and we presume they're going to follow it in good faith and not hallucinate. Though they may be drunk. I mean, again, I see it as very similar.
And I think that's the central challenge: is how do you embrace automation? Because the complexity of the technology is going to require it, but at the same time having human in the loop for risk acceptance, risk tolerance, accountability, value judgments. So thank you all so much for participating in this. We'll stick around for questions afterwards. We're passionate about this, so we could talk about this all day. But again, thank you so much.
Thank you guys so much for the conversation.